Oh, I'm Tim Callahan. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to present to CornCon. I hate that I cannot be there in person, but with travel restrictions and quite frankly, some illness, I'm not able to attend. But I hope this will be a valuable presentation. I'm going to kind of talk to you my experience and journey from basically a compliance centric security model to one where we've evolved to resiliency. The information security program, I've been in information security probably a little over 20 years now in the civilian world, and I've seen it really morph from a very compliance-centric kind of program to one that is really business enabling. And I think it's one, we will continue to progress and evolve, but I think we're really getting to the point where most senior executives within companies, especially companies that are regulated, companies that have a lot of customer information or critical infrastructure companies, the executives are seeing it as an essential program to protect the company and protect the critical assets of the company. Compliance, and many of you in the audience may remember these days. I remember when I first worked for a bank, our program was really centered on compliance. The FFIEC, the Federal Financial Examination, Federal Financial Industry Examination Council, would issue guidance, and then we would be examined on our compliance with that guidance. It's not that we were not concerned about, quote, security. It's just at that time, there wasn't that big of a threat. I can recall a bank that recruited me, and I went there and I asked them what the challenge was. And they said they wanted to become an acquiring bank. They wanted to have a federal charter. They wanted to do, to expand greatly their business, but their regulatory environment was hampering that their particular regulator would not sign off on some of the things they want to do until they got their technology risk and security program within their accepted regulatory standards. And so that was my mission. There was very little talk about the criminal threat, actual fraud, those kinds of things. It was really concentrated on getting us into compliance. And then we discovered some time after that, we started to see an increase in the criminal threat. And many of y'all, again, know that the many companies that were, quote, in compliance were breached anyway. So we knew that we could not rely on just compliance. So you started to see security programs come about that were multifaceted. And we had to learn, we had to grow. On this chart, it shows some of the essential elements of a security program. This is not all of them, but very important to the program became threat intelligence and vulnerability management, a strong security ops that had the ability to monitor the environment and to be trained on how to respond to incidents. We had to look at it from a standpoint, a holistic standpoint of information governance and risk management. Certainly, in the days of compliance, vendor security was important, but it became even more important as part of the supply chain. So we saw this evolving into this acknowledgement that we had to protect our environments from threats, criminal, nation state, whatever. So then this started to bring on a discipline of what really a strong security program consisted of. And this is a kind of a high level brief statement of what the anatomy of a security program is. It's all about understanding your risk and then selecting a framework that you can measure yourself by. You can begin to understand based on your particular risk profile of your company and the risk tolerance of your company, what type of framework you need, and then what components of that framework are important to the company. And then from that, you develop a strategy, you establish a governance program, an oversight program, one of accountability, having understanding who control owners with various aspects of the company, those kinds of things. And then you allocate resources that's commensurate with your risk tolerance, and with the strategy. And then you can get into the basics of the NIST cybersecurity framework in this case, where you identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. But then you need an assurance program that kind of brings you back into that loop. So it's always a continual improving and understanding. So that takes us kind of back to the maturity. So you've got compliance, you've got security. Now, how do you measure it? And that's through some type of maturity mechanism. Basically, you're measuring yourself against your framework, certainly, and are you hitting the needs of that framework? Are you doing your self-assessments? How do you define and report on key program measures so that you can give your governance, whether it's board or executive governance programs, some status on maturity? It's important to have independent assessments that will not only gauge your maturity, but will also tell you, kind of benchmark you against the industry and tell you how you're measuring in your industry. Are you on par, or are you behind, or are you ahead of? And certainly the magic in a security program is always to be at least as good as your peer group, so that you're kind of in that herd. Some would say you want to be a little bit better than your peer group, and that can be true. I think the difficulty you get in there is everybody's trying to be a little bit better than the peer group. It almost becomes an arms race. But at any rate, that's one of the strategies. I think it's very important too that you have some mechanism. I use a business security scorecard, and that's basically where we've taken those aspects that the business can control and the business are reliant on, and score them on that. Things like, how many high-risk vendors they have, or high-risk vendors with exceptions where they're not meeting the standards, how many exceptions, high-risk exceptions, and are they progressing towards remediation on those exceptions. Things like, we do phishing test scores, so we'll tell them how their employees in that department or in that division are doing on their phishing scores. But it's important that you let the business know and hold them accountable for the things they can control. Now, so much of our security program, they don't have control over. I mean, we have a centralized security program, so we do all the monitoring and the incident response and those kinds of things. Certainly, we don't hold the business accountable for that, but there are things that they can do. And through that mechanism, it continuously brings us to a higher level of maturity. So I think it's very important that we pay attention to maturity. But then, there started to be, we started seeing in the industry a whole lot of security breaches. And out of that came a whole lot of litigation. And so I think, as security professionals, we needed to start taking that into account. The defensibility of our program. Have we established a program that if we're deposed, or if there's legal action, or if there's regulatory action, is it defensible? Have we practiced a standard of reasonableness? I mean, most regulatory regimes, most legal standards are that you have a program that is reasonable and commensurate with the size and complexity, the risk of your organization. So that becomes kind of the defensible standard. How do you define that? And how do you defend that? Certainly having some type of industry accepted framework, whether it's NIST or some of the other good ones out there, having a program, that maturity program, contributes heavily to this. So you can say, I've been assessed by independent, we mark ourselves on maturity, we score ourselves, we hold ourselves accountable across the company, and we've implemented this framework. So that becomes part of the defensibility. You know, when we see ourselves in some of these risk decisions, are we looking at it from a standpoint of, at some point, I may have to defend this. And would this be deemed reasonable in that light? And certainly, you know, some of those judgments are you know, hard to make. But if you're kind of pointing in the right direction, consulting with your internal legal team, those kinds of things, generally you wind up okay. We found out, even with this, that we also have to look at, or start looking in light of resiliency. There's a quote here by Richard A. Clarke that he and his co-author Robert Konecki wrote a book called The Fifth Domain. And part of what they did is they went and they studied companies that had been breached and somewhat survived the breach, came out kind of okay. Companies that had been breached but didn't do so well. And then they compared, and what they found is that the companies that really concentrated on resiliency, and you can define resiliency many ways. For the sake of this conversation, it's really thinking through, if we have an incident, how will we respond to that? What are our controls? How will we detect that? How can we build our systems, our network, our business in a way that can withstand some of the impact of a cyber attack, so that we can continue to do business and continue to serve our customers? All of this forms this kind of philosophy of resiliency. And I think that's something that, you know, the security professionals are really having to look at a lot more. We know that no matter how good we do, we're going to still be subject to attack, or maybe even a successful attack. So just building that possibility into your program is very important. You know, I recall a story of JP Morgan Chase way back when they had a breach a few years back, I should say. You know, they actually did a pretty good job. They detected it, it was contained. Although it was a very aggressive attack, they were able to contain it, and then they came out all right. I remember Jamie Dimon coming and making a public statement about it, saying, look, we take security seriously. We're a big bank. We want to protect our customers. We spend a lot of money on security. You know, that response that JP Morgan did to that particular incident, I think served them very well. But those are the kinds of things that build you toward a more resilient environment. And so what are some keys to resiliency? Well, we, some years back, in 2017, I believe it was, we decided to adopt an all hazards approach to our planning, to our crisis management. And we kind of shifted away from a facility-centric recovery model. And, you know, again, some of you may remember the days where every business recovery type strategy involved, well, we're going to bring in trailers and we're going to put people in trailers. Well, we started calculating one day, or I started calculating how many trailers I would need. And there was no place to park all the trailers if we were really going to do that. And it presented a lot of other issues. So we adopted a work from anywhere model. And when I say that, it's, you know, we put in the security, the technology infrastructure, we invested in several flexible access technologies so that our people could go anywhere, get into the environment and work. You know, certainly we had to build in defenses to make sure that we could do that and do that safely. So when, and through that, we saw that it would meet so many different scenarios. So if we could work from anywhere, it could address, physical, environmental type concerns, disasters, ice storms, snowstorms, the kinds of things that, at least down in Georgia, tends to paralyze us. It could address pandemic, and so that became a critical part of our pandemic plan. When we found in 2020 that we would have to go out of the workplace, because we had adopted that, it really enabled us to do that fairly quickly. So that's an example where building in that resiliency really has helped us out in several scenarios. We're seeing more, movement to the cloud. So that will also help in our resiliency, because the nature of the cloud, being able to spin up, spin down, being able to have different regions, those kinds of things also contribute to us. I will also add, we started a campaign of not relying on printed documents. And we did that to help people. It wasn't just, oh, we don't want to kill trees. That's certainly part of it, a very important part of it. But it was, we can make you so much more independent if you build in processes that you can do digitally and not be reliant on a piece of paper. And that really helped us tremendously in the pandemic response. We follow a response program that very quickly classifies incidents as to the degree of severity, and they also, that drives kind of our response plan. Many and most things happen at a very local level, so we've got local plans in particular cities or regions or whatever that we work in that can be contained there. And then we split ourselves into regional crisis plans of maybe impacting whole countries rather than globally. And then certainly we have the global response plan, and we have a well-defined criteria for these, but also a well-defined response, knowing when to escalate to that next level and then what to do. We practice our global crisis management plan at least annually with our executives. We do it more frequently with our different teams, our global crisis teams, our technology teams, et cetera. But we at least have a once a year tabletop exercise so that everybody knows kind of what the plan is and what to do. That helps build our resiliency. So anyway, just some takeaways here as I kind of tie these loose ends up. Compliance is table stakes. We know that we've got to do that to stay in business. If you're in a regulated business, especially, you just have to do that. If you're going to take customer credit cards, you have to comply with the PCI standards. That's just essential, but that won't protect you. You have to really have a strong security program, one that you understand your risk, you've identified it, you've quantified it, you've got a defined risk tolerance that you're working towards, and then measuring it through a maturity program is very important. Otherwise, you don't know when you're getting there. And I'm not saying that you'll ever be at your particular maturity mark. It's kind of a journey. You'll get there. You'll nudge up, criteria may change, you may have to but it gives you something that you can measure yourself again. And then considering defensibility, again, how important that is to understand, the standard of reasonableness and are you meeting it? But now driving towards resiliency. Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity.